What's going on, y'all? Attorney Tom here, back with a fan favorite USCSB React. You might be asking, Tom, why do you look like you're a wannabe musician? It's because we're in our new office. My camera's not set up. It's freezing in here. It's 60 degrees in here. I'm freezing my butt off. So I'm at my producer's desk, and I'm going to do this React. So what are we going to do? USCSB React. I'm going to add a little twist to it. USCSB, they usually give you the facts, and then they list their takeaways, their safety takeaways. It's usually 3 or 4 or 5. But before they announce them, I am going to guess what they are, and we'll see if I can issue spot correctly. Also, I apologize. I tried to make a video yesterday. It was the worst video of all time. I was traveling for work. I attempted to vlog. Worst vlog of all time. Wasn't even up to Spamuary stats. Here's a little clip from it. I just want to clear up any rumors. I had to pee so bad I went to the next gas station. And look what there is. I did not go in that Arby's. Promise. You didn't want to see that. Let's jump right into it.
Vakker's Charleston, Tennessee facility manufactures various silicon-based materials that are used in the production of a variety of products. On November 2nd, 2020, the company initiated a 2-week turnaround of its hydrogen chloride regeneration unit to perform routine maintenance as well as equipment upgrades and repairs. To assist with the turnaround, Vakker employed contract workers from multiple companies, including Jake Marshall and Penn Gulf.
Okay, we just got a lot of very important information. First, a 2-week turnaround for routine maintenance, upgrading systems. What I want to know, if I was the lawyer, is why 2 weeks? Should it have been 3 weeks? Should it have been 4 weeks? Did they give adequate time for these maintenance procedures to take place? And that's an issue because if they didn't give enough amount of time and contractors or employees or whoever was in charge of the maintenance or repairs felt rushed, that could cause major issues. Second, and this is an extremely important fact, my hair stands up as a plaintiff's lawyer hearing this. Because there was so much work to do, they brought on multiple third-party crews, at least two third-party crews. We don't know how many exactly yet, but third-party crews to work on the facility. Why is this important? Because as a lawyer, if I'm representing a hurt person, if they are a third-party contractor, we likely have the most amount of remedies available. That's because, depending on the state, if you are truly an employee of the refinery facility, you might be barred to recovery by workers' compensation, which is why if an employee of a refinery gets blown up or injured or burned, you often see the lawyers having to come up with some more difficult theory, like a product's defect case or negligent design or whatever, because you have to sue somebody other than the employer, because workers' comp is a scam, and it basically protects the big corporations who, in my opinion, kill people. So we have 2-week turnaround, and we have third-party crews.
13th, Vakker issued a work permit to Jake Marshall to perform maintenance on a heat exchanger's vapor outlet piping. The work was to be done while hydrogen chloride was actively flowing through the piping. Exposure to hydrogen chloride gas can cause injuries, ranging from irritation of the eyes and lungs to severe burns or death. To protect themselves from those chemical hazards, the Jake Marshall contractors wore full-body chemical-resistant suits, rubber boots and gloves, and full-face respirators with acid gas cartridges. The maintenance took place on the 5th floor of an equipment access structure, which only had one staircase for entry and exit.
The USCSB is so intentional with their words. They just said, this took place on a structure with one stairway, one exit, one entrance. That could be a problem, especially if it's foreseeable, like it's always foreseeable, that an incident occurs blocking one entrance or exit.
Contractors from Penn Gulf were also working on the same 5th floor platform. The Penn Gulf employees, however, were performing insulation activities that were not expected to involve potential exposure to hydrogen chloride. For their insulation work, the 4 Penn Gulf contractors were wearing the minimum personal protective equipment.
Wow. Okay. This is starting to look like a recipe for disaster. So you have 2 separate contractors working on the same structure. You have one where they are potentially touching chemicals and in a full PPE protective gear. And then you have others who maybe if this job were isolated, they said that they were just putting in insulation. If this were an isolated job, just need this minimum PPE, just the minimal gear. You're fine. No hazard. Why can't I talk? I'm freezing. I am freezing. No gas mask, no gloves, nothing that the other people have. They have gloves. You get the point. You get the point. You have 2 jobs, but they need to be communicating. The key to this is communication. I'm learning from my wife. She says I need to communicate. Not only does Wacker, that's not how they're pronouncing it, Wagner, not only does Wagner need to communicate with each third-party group separately, they need to ensure that multiple third-party groups are communicating with each other, because this can't happen, because these people are clearly in the wrong PPE gear for another task that is happening right next to them.
They had escape respirators and safety harnesses in their possession, but were not actively wearing those items. The Jake Marshall contractor's task was to tighten bolts on the heat exchanger's vapor outlet piping in order to minimize leaks. The amount of force required to tighten a bolt is based in part on the materials of construction of the equipment being connected. The amount of force is called the torque requirement. The torque requirement for bolts connecting steel to steel is higher than the torque requirement for bolts connecting steel to graphite, as graphite is a very brittle material. But on the day of the incident, Jake Marshall pipe fitters were not given written specifications for every bolt they would tighten. A Jake Marshall journeyman provided an apprentice pipe fitter with a torque wrench set to 40 foot-pounds.
They were not providing written communication about the correct torque value that needed to be applied to each of these volts. The journeyman was told verbally, probably because they were told, just not told in writing, and then he turned around and told his apprentice. Have you ever played the game Telephone? Have you ever, when you say a word and then you pass it and then 10 people later it's a completely different word? That's what's happening here. Again, communication. Written policies get followed because they are easy, because anybody can read and pick them up and do them. So they have a failed communication between the 2 groups, third parties, and now they have failure of communicating what needs to be done correctly to individual groups.
After tightening the bolts requiring 40 foot-pounds of torque, the pipe fitter then used the torque wrench to tighten bolts on the steel to graphite connection. But the manufacturer recommended torque value for those bolts is only 15 foot-pounds. At 10:04 a.m., the excess torque applied to those bolts caused the heat exchanger to crack. Hazardous hydrogen chloride released to the atmosphere between the workers and the only available staircase. Within 15 seconds, a large hydrogen chloride cloud filled the area, preventing the workers on the platform from seeing their surroundings. The apprentice pipe fitter quickly moved away from the release. As he did, his chemical suit became entangled on surrounding equipment and tore open. This exposed him to hydrogen chloride, which caused chemical burns. In the chaos, he bumped into equipment on the platform, which knocked off his respirator. Although he was located closest to the staircase, without a respirator, he could not pass through the hazardous cloud to exit. Instead, he moved to the opposite side of the platform, where the other contractors had been working. 3 of the 4 Penn Gulf employees put on their escape respirators. But without chemical suits, they were unable to walk through the cloud to reach the staircase located on the opposite side of the platform. Instead, they attempted to climb down piping on the side of the structure, which was approximately 70 feet high. While climbing down, all three fell to the ground. One worker was fatally injured from the fall, and two sustained serious injuries.
This is definitely going to be one of their observations. The one way in, one way out. They had to crawl down this building, and they fell fatally. And on top of them only being one way in, one way out, they also couldn't use the one exit because one, it was blocked, and two, they didn't have the correct PPE.
The remaining Penn Gulf worker was able to put on her escape respirator with help from a Jake Marshall worker, who, wearing chemical-resistant PPE, also attempted to shield her from the hazardous hydrogen chloride. The dangerous release continued for approximately 3 minutes until all the gaseous hydrogen chloride had escaped from the system.
The leak went on for 3 minutes. Is that an appropriate amount of time? Remember, having an incident is foreseeable. So what are your mitigation policies? Should it have been shut off in 30 seconds? Is it possible to shut off in this particular situation, given the complexity and given the actual systems in place? Or is 3 minutes a reasonable amount of time, given that there is an incident that has transpired? We don't know.
After the release stopped, the 3 Jake Marshall workers and 1 Penn Gulf worker used the staircase to evacuate the area and safely reach the ground. The Chemical Safety Board launched an investigation and found 4 key safety issues
All right, 4 issues. 4 issues. Time to guess. Okay, the USCSB says there are 4 tips. I'm going to try to guess them. First, lack of communication. This is a lack of communication both with the pipe fitter. They didn't provide written communication, and also lack of communication with multiple parties, okay? So Faulkner needs to communicate with both parties, both independent contractors, and they need to ensure that they are talking together. Because again, the party with the minimal PPE, they need to be aware that a potentially hazardous job is occurring right next to them. So lack of communication. 2, I'm going to go with 3 minutes. It took 3 minutes for the hydrogen chloride to shut off. The USCSB is very particular. I think that they said that because it should have been shorter. Because it was going for 3 minutes, these individuals were trapped on the platform and they decided to jump. Some got burned. So 3 minutes hyphen lack of mitigation. Remember, it is foreseeable that something happens. You need systems in place to mitigate it. And so when it does happen, the damage isn't as bad. Third, I'm gonna go one way in, one way out. That's a huge problem. They mentioned that multiple times. I'd be willing to bet that that one is almost certainly on there. Number 4, let's see, what else do we have? We have communication, 3 minutes, one way in, one way out. Dirk, don't put me like thinking about it forever. I'm gonna go lack of PPE. This goes with the lack of communication. I think they're gonna say that having multiple different companies there, third parties, multiple of them, and them not communicating with each other, but that's still not an excuse, right? If you are on a refinery, you need to have the appropriate PPE. Because these people didn't have the appropriate PPE, they were forced to jump off this building because they didn't have the correct equipment. Those are my 4. Let's see how it turns out.
They are written procedures, control of hazardous energy, simultaneous operations, and means of egress.
Okay, for sure got 1. Probably, I think I lumped written procedures and simultaneous operations into communication. Control of hazardous energy is probably the 3 minutes, I think. Let's find out.
The first safety issue concerns written procedures. OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard and the EPA's Risk Management Plan rule required Wacker to implement written operating and maintenance procedures for covered processes and equipment. These should have included clear instructions for how to tighten the different types of connections present on the heat exchanger's vapor outlet piping. But the CSB found that Wacker did not have a written procedure to execute the task. Instead, Wacker relied on verbal instructions. The manual, however, did not include the torque requirements for the bolts that were eventually over-tightened.
So there you go. I'm sure Wacker will say, hey, we told the third-party contractors what the appropriate torque is, and they messed it up. It's their fault. But that's not going to fly because, again, it is foreseeable. Safety standards, procedures, telephone miscommunication, the game of telephone, that is foreseeable. You need written processes in place to avoid something like this from happening. Additionally, the written manual that they did turn over, the things in writing, did not have the torque requirements. So, communication.
The CSB learned that the correct torque requirements were verbally communicated by the Wacker permit authorizer to the Jake Marshall foreman. The foreman then relayed the torque requirements to the journeyman pipe fitter, who finally communicated the information to the apprentice, who ultimately tightened the bolt.
The game of telephone.
The second safety issue identified by the CSB is control of hazardous energy. The CSB found that Wacker had procedures in place for performing work on equipment that contained hazardous energy, such as pressurized chemicals. These procedures included safety precautions, such as developing an energy isolation plan, wearing PPE, and barricading the area to prevent access by workers not involved in the operation. But even though the heat exchanger vapor outlet piping contained pressurized hazardous chemicals, the company did not apply those procedures to the torquing operation. That is because the torquing operation did not involve the intentional opening of the process equipment.
So I completely missed this one, did not include it. Makes total sense, right? The reason why the other crew, this is, I lumped it all into communication. I'm actually pretty upset with myself because you can't just lump everything in, right? There's no excuse. Poor performance on my part. I'm chalking it up to the cold. In the simplest of terms, Wacker underestimated their opponent. What I mean by that is they anticipated nothing going wrong. And when nothing goes wrong, in theory, you don't need any PPE because they said, hey, there will be no chemicals exposed, so it's not that big of a deal. But you have to account for the foreseeability of something going wrong. So they underestimated their opponent, improper risk assessment. I did not include this in my chart. I get a demerit.
Wacker did not develop an energy isolation plan, nor did they perform a risk analysis to determine whether the torquing could be safely performed on equipment in operation. Also, Wacker did not barricade the area to prevent other workers, such as the Penn Gulf insulation team, from being in the area when the work occurred. The third safety issue discovered by the CSB is simultaneous operations. Simultaneous operations, or SIMOPS, is defined as a situation in which two or more operations occur together at the same time and place. The simultaneous work performed by Jake Marshall and Penn Gulf personnel on the platform was a type of SIMOPS. The CSB found that Wacker did not have a policy or procedure for evaluating SIMOPS.
I'm giving myself a half point here. I identified it in my mind, the communication issue, the communication gap between not only Wacker and the third parties, but then the third parties between each other. It's not as clear as I would like. I'm still disappointed in myself. I'm going to give myself a half point, lumping under communication. So basically, I got 1 point for communication when I should have been more specific. It should have been 2 separate points.
The CSB also determined that industry guidance regarding SIMOPS has largely been restricted to offshore processing, such as oil and gas drilling. In fact, during its investigation, the CSB was unable to identify any codes, standards, or regulations specifically relating to the identification and control of SIMOPS for maintenance activities conducted on stationary source chemical processes.
prevent other needless tragedies, the CSB believes that the lack of regulation and guidance surrounding SIMOPS is a safety gap that must be rectified.
Right. And look, this is what it's all about. We will not do these people justice if we don't learn from the mistakes and apply it to the future to help other people. The CSB is stating that there's a lack of SIMOP regulation and detail, so we need to get on that. There needs to be rules. People need to be educated about the risks of SIMOPS.
Finally, the last safety issue identified by the CSB is means of egress. The CSB learned that Kherkher performed a process hazard analysis 3 months before the incident, which identified the need for a ladder or some additional means of egress on the equipment access structure in case a hydrogen chloride release blocked workers from accessing.
Wow, that is a game changer in the actual case, because now you go from constructive notice of should Kherkher have known that there's one way in, one way out, that was a threat, to actual notice because they did their own assessment and they recognized the threat and didn't do anything about it. That, if I'm the lawyer and I'm suing them, that drives the value of the case way up. Because what is a jury going to think about that? That is not okay.
Prior to the incident, multiple employees also discussed concerns with Kherkher management on the need for a secondary exit on the structure. But the CSB found that Kherkher did not take any action to address these concerns before the incident. The CSB interviews with Kherkher employees indicated a perception among the workers that management deferred employee concerns because Kherkher management understood the building to be designed per code.
That is not an excuse. Just because something is designed to code doesn't mean you can't be negligent. It's not an excuse.
7 workers were present on the 5th floor platform during the toxic release, with blocked stairs as the only point of egress.
While building codes are an important foundation in design, they do not necessarily consider the specific hazards posed by a given process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, I'm giving myself that one. Okay, y'all, that's it for today's video. I'm giving myself a 2.5 out of 4. Or what am I doing? 1, 2, yeah, 2 out of 4. All right, talk to you later.